Hello, hello everyone. Good afternoon in the Americas. Good evening in London. Welcome to the Lloyd's Latin America and the Caribbean Academy, the last session of our academy in 2021. I hope you have enjoyed all of the sessions until now. Today we have a very interesting topic, aviation risks, and we are already joined by the Lancashire team that's going to be presenting all about aviation risks to you. I will be making a quick introduction of the three speakers of the session today. But before doing that, I just want to say to you, if you have any questions, if you want to ask any questions to them, please use the Q&A box. Leave your question there. We're going to be addressing your questions at the end of the presentation. So today we have from the Lancashire Syndicate at Lloyd's, Jimmy Curtis. He has joined Syndicate Lancashire 3010 as an aviation underwriter in July 2020. Prior to joining the syndicate, Jimmy spent over 10 years at Aviation Syndicate, originally starting with claims and subsequently joining the aviation underwriting team in 2014. We also have Michael Bush, who joined Lancashire Syndicate at Lloyd's in December 2012, initially as a member of the IT team. And in 2014, he joined the Aviation All Risks and Aviation War team as an underwriter assistant and was promoted to assistant underwriter in 2019. Last but not least, we have Matt Goff. He joined Lancashire Syndicate at Lloyd's in October 2018 as an aviation underwriter, specializing in new products line, hull deductible. From 2009, he worked for Aspen within the financial team before moving internally to the aviation team in 2010 as an underwriter assistant at the time. He was promoted to an assistant underwriter in 2013, then to underwriter in 2016, with authority across all lines of aviation business. So without further ado, I'll just pass over to you, Matt, to introduce you and the team.
Thank you, Marco. So firstly, I want to say hello to everybody and thank you for attending today. We understand that the take-up has been really good, so it's great to be given the opportunity to be able to speak to a large audience. We would like to thank you, Marco and Deanna, for organising today and the rest of the team for giving Lancashire the opportunity to be able to speak to the LATAM and Caribbean Lloyd's Academy group. It's certainly a pleasure to be able to do this and to talk to you about some of the risks that we, as an insurance market, have to find solutions for on a day-to-day basis to satisfy our clients' needs. LATAM and the Caribbean are a particularly important part of the world to aviation, so hopefully this will be of direct interest to some of you. The class of aviation business is of particular interest to us as insurers of the class. For instance, we enjoy the tangible element of the risk. We're all aware of airlines or aircraft, and many of us will have flown ourselves. So aviation is very much a familiar product to most people. The plan for today, and we're very cognizant of time, is to split this into three sections, which will be presented by two colleagues and myself. And it's worth noting today that we'll be focusing on what we specialise in at Lancashire. The first part of the day will be presented by my colleague Jimmy Curtis, who will discuss some of the elements of the aviation risk and what is known as airline and general aviation, and the elements of hull and liability insurance. He'll also touch upon the inclusions and exclusions of a typical policy. I'll be second up. My name is Matt, and I'll discuss with you the components of hull deductible and why carriers or airlines might want to consider buying the product. I'll discuss some of the claims that we see and how it's linked to the airline cover that Jimmy will discuss prior. Third up will be Michael Bush, who will discuss with you the hull war class using some well-known market events, and Jimmy will conclude discussing the pandemic. Once the presentations are over, we'll happily take any questions, and I should also mention that we believe Matthew Thomas is on the call. Matthew is Lancashire's Deputy Active Underwriter for our Lloyd's 3010 Syndicate, and he's also Head of Aviation War. So thank you, and I'll pass you over to Jimmy.
Thanks very much, Matt. So it's probably best that we start by discussing what we actually mean when we talk about aviation insurance, and specifically aviation insurance within the London market. So aviation as a class of business is generally split into three subclasses. On the screen there, you'll see airline, general aviation, and aerospace. Airline, which is generally written under the H2 and L2 risk code, is generally perceived to consist of narrow body or wide body jet aircraft, as well as turboprop engined aircraft, which provide commercial air transport services for passengers or cargo. An airline can operate domestically or internationally on pre-agreed scheduled routes. An airline can range from a single aircraft right through to a global fleet. Next, we have general aviation, which is underwritten on the H3 and L3 risk codes, and it tends to consist of light aircraft, which are able to operate both commercially or non-commercially. Unlike airline, which is solely fixed wing, general aviation can consist of rotor wing, fixed wing, UAVs, drones, gliders, and hot air balloons. Again, unlike airline, general aviation can consist of a vast array of uses. As per the image you see in front of you now, you've got a helicopter that's being used for firefighting, but equally you can see, or you may see a helicopter that's used for slung, medevac, heli skiing. You may see a business jet fleet that's used for the commercial passenger transportation of VIP personnel, amongst other uses. Similar to an airline fleet, a general aviation risk can consist of a single aircraft right through to a large portfolio of aviation assets. Lastly, you have aerospace, which, unlike airline and general aviation, is solely focused upon the legal liability to third parties. The aerospace class is generally split into two separate segments. You have the airport owners and operators liability. This provides third-party legal liability for bodily injury or property damage caused as a result of operations airside. Typical buyers of this policy include air traffic controllers, ground handlers, or baggage handlers. A typical claim that you might see within this class of business includes the ground handler, which is transporting an aircraft which is airside from one part of the airfield to another. That ground handler causes damage to the aircraft, and as a result, the insurer of that ground handler would effectively compensate that aircraft owner for any physical damage to that aircraft. Next, we have products liability. Within this class, we provide third-party legal liability for bodily injury or property damage caused as a result of a failure, defect, hazard of an aviation product or service. Typical buyers of this cover include aircraft manufacturers or aircraft refuelers. A prime example of a claim you might see within this category of coverage or cover would be an aircraft refueler. So the service that aircraft refueler is providing is the fuel itself. That is their product. If an aircraft was to suffer a loss or to crash, and the proximate cause of that loss was deemed to be contamination of the fuel, that aircraft refueler would be deemed to be liable, and as a consequence, that insurance policy would respond and compensate the passengers for any bodily injury, the aircraft owner for any physical damage to the aircraft, and any legal liability to third parties if that was the case. So next, we're going to look at the coverage in terms of what we actually cover on an all-risk policy. Within the London market, we tend to follow a standard wording, otherwise known as AVM1C. AVM1C is broken into three distinct categories. You have Section 1, which is in regards to the hull, Section 2, which is in regards to the liabilities to third parties, and Section 3, which is in regards to the liabilities to passengers. So Section 1 is, as I mentioned previously, it's in regards to the hull. It's the subject matter of the insurance. It's the aircraft in question. And effectively, underwriters are giving cover for accidental loss of or damage to the aircraft arising from the risk covered. I stress the point there that the damage that causes the damage that's caused has to be accidental. It has to be a one-off event, and it cannot be intentional. Similarly, there is also you notice there that it says the risks covered. So before entering into a contract, both the insured and the insurer must have a set of risks which are agreed to be covered within that policy. Exclusions applicable to this section of the policy wording. We do not cover any wear and tear, deterioration, breakdown of any component within the aircraft. It has to be a one-off event, an accidental one-off event. Equally, there'll be no defect or failure coverage. That would be picked up in the products liability market, which I discussed previously. Conditions applicable to this section: no dismantling or repairs can be undertaken without the insurer's consent. The policy itself, or the aircraft itself, is insured on what's known as a value basis, whereby in the event of a loss, the insurers will pay for the cost of any repairs, or equally, they would replace the aircraft with a similar type. There can be an amendment to the basis of this policy cover. The aircraft can be insured on an agreed value basis. In this circumstance, the aircraft has got a monetary value, and in the event of a constructive total loss or a total loss, that monetary value will be paid to the insured as compensation. Equally, any claim that's made or paid by the insurers will be subject to an excess or a deductible. It's worth noting that in terms of general aviation policies, that deductible tends to be a percentage of the aircraft value. Within the airline market, that deductible tends to be a monetary amount which is attributed to that particular aircraft, and the size of that deductible will vary depending upon the type of aircraft or the value of the aircraft. But this is something that Matt's going to discuss in the deductible section of the presentation. Next, we have section 2, which is looking at the liabilities to third parties. Within this section, insurers will indemnify the insured for all sums which the insured is legally liable to pay for compensatory damages to third parties for accidental bodily injury and accidental damage to property caused by the aircraft or by any person or object falling therefrom. So the point to note here is within section 2, it's strictly limited to third parties. A third party is deemed to be anyone outside of the aircraft, and that is the only cover that would fall within this section. As well as the claims themselves, insurers will also cover any legal costs or expenses in those claims that are brought against the insured. Exclusions applicable to this section: any loss sustained by employees, operational crew or passengers would not be covered. Equally, any loss or damage to any property belonging to the insured. As I mentioned, the third party is generally deemed to be anyone outside of the aircraft, not those operating the aircraft or any employees of the insured. Section 3, insurers will indemnify the insured for all sums which the insured is legally liable to pay as compensatory damages for accidental bodily injury and loss of or damage to baggage and personal articles of passengers arising out of an accident to the aircraft. So a passenger is generally deemed to be anyone that has purchased a ticket to fly on that particular aircraft. And as you can see within this section, we're again covering bodily injury or damage to any property belonging to that passenger. I stress the point again that it has to be an accident which gives rise to this loss. Without the accident, the passenger has no entitlement to proceed with a claim against the insured. Equally, like section 2, the insurers will cover any legal costs or expenses incurred in defending any actions brought against the insured from those passengers. Similarly, if you look at the exclusions, again, any loss sustained by employees or operational crew would not be covered. It is for passengers only deemed to be those who have purchased a ticket to fly on the aircraft. It should be noted, however, that there can be an extension of coverage, which allows for employees or operational crew to be treated as if they were passengers. So on the next slide, we're going to look at the general exclusions and general conditions applicable to a standard aviation policy. So within a standard aviation policy, as I mentioned earlier, there's generally a pre-agreed use, which forms the basis of the insurance premium. In the event of any loss that's caused by a use which isn't pre-agreed, which falls outside of those uses which were agreed by both the insurer or the insured, the insurer would have reasonable grounds to decline the claim. Equally, there are a set of geographical limits which are pre-agreed by both the insurer and the insured. In the event of any loss taking place outside of those pre-agreed geographical limits, the insurer are well within their rights to decline the claim. Equally, any aircraft needs to be operated inside the manufacturer's approvals and recommendations. If the cause of the loss was deemed to be non-compliant to those manufacturer approvals or recommendations, the insurers will have reasonable grounds to decline the claim. And last but not least, we have AVN 48B, which Michael's going to discuss a little bit further on in the presentation, but effectively this excludes any damage to the aircraft as a result of war perils. War perils are generally bought on a standalone basis in a whole war policy. As I mentioned, Michael's side of the presentation will discuss this further. In terms of general conditions applicable to an aviation policy, they tend to mirror general conditions within other classes of business. The insured must act with the necessary due diligence and act as if they're uninsured at all times. The insured, the aircraft owner or operator, must comply with all necessary air navigation orders, ensuring that the aircraft is airworthy at all times. Any variation in the risk must be advised to insurers and agreed. And equally, insurers can exercise the right to subrogation where subrogation may exist. So now that we've discussed the coverage at hand, we're now going to look at why an aircraft owner and aircraft operator may purchase aviation insurance. Again, I've split this into the two elements being hull and liability. So from a hull perspective, it gives them that peace of mind. Aviation equipment tends to be quite expensive. And also it gives them that peace of mind in terms of not only are we covering the risk from an operational standpoint, we're also giving cover for natural perils such as weather events, hail damage, tornadoes, hurricanes, fire and theft. If we look at it from a commercial standpoint, airlines and other commercial general aviation operators, the aircraft themselves are seen as revenue tools. In the event of a loss or that aircraft being out of action for a period of time, it could be detrimental to the revenues and profits of that operator. And lastly, the third point connects back to the first point, actually, in terms of aircraft being the expensive assets that they are generally purchased on finance agreements. And within those finance agreements, there tends to be compulsory requirements that the relevant and necessary insurance is taken out. From a liability standpoint, in order to operate an aircraft, in order for the aircraft to fly, there are aviation laws and conventions which dictate minimum levels of third-party legal cover and passenger legal liability cover. The size of this limit or the amount of cover required will depend upon the area of operation, whether it's domestic or international, whether the operation is commercial or non-commercial, the number of passengers that may be aboard the aircraft, and the maximum takeoff mass of that particular aircraft. So now we're going to look at how aviation policies are placed within the London market generally. So a standard airline policy, for example, if we were to look at an airline placement can carry large liability limits as much as $2 billion. And hull exposures can range up to hundreds of millions of dollars. So the policy itself is placed on a subscription market basis, whereby each insurer takes a percentage of that particular risk. The aviation market is unique in itself in the way in which the overall risk is placed. It's known as a verticalized market. So in other specialty classes of business, what you tend to have is the leader will set the terms, coverage, and the premium of the risk, and the following market would subscribe to that risk at those terms. Within the aviation market, you can have a leader which sets the terms of coverage, the pricing, and the following market may choose that pricing isn't sufficient, the coverage is too broad, and they could end up with a risk that has 10 different markets on it at 10 different sets of terms. Policies have a losses occurring basis, so the claim has to take place during that policy period, and they're generally written on a 12-month basis. So now we've looked at what's covered, why we buy it, and how it's placed, or why an aircraft operator or owner would buy the insurance. Let's look at how we actually, as underwriters, price the risk. So again, this is split into the hull element and the liability element. So if we look at the hull element first, if we was to use a general aviation example, so if we was to have a helicopter brought to us from a broker, we would look at that particular aircraft, we would look at the value of that aircraft, the manufacturer of that aircraft, the number of engines that aircraft might have, for example. We'd then look at the type of operation. Some uses are deemed more hazardous than other uses. For example, if you had a helicopter that was used for the private use of the owner, it's going to carry a different load into a helicopter that's used for firefighting or slung or medevac, for example. We then look at the area of operation, where the helicopter may be operating or where the aircraft may be operating, the landscape within that country, the altitude the aircraft is operating at, how mountainous, the weather within that country, if there are mountains within that country, for example. Then we'd look at the pilot experience. We'd look at how experienced that pilot is on that particular type of aircraft, their overall experience, any particular licenses they have. We'd then look at the annual utilisation for the forthcoming policy period. And then we'd look at the loss history. This isn't unique to aviation, but it's a fairly standard rating measure. We'd look at the loss history of that operator, of that insured. We'd then look at it for that type of aircraft, doing that particular operation in that area of the world with a pilot with the experience that this risk brings. In terms of liability, we'd look at the type of operation, whether it's commercial or non-commercial. We'd look at the size of the limit that's required. We'd look at the aircraft loading, the number of passengers that may be aboard, or the cargo that's being carried. We'd look at the passenger profiling and the law and jurisdiction. Different passengers can have different claim actions being brought in different courts around the world, which will carry a different liability award. And a standalone point there, you have additional liability coverages. So if the insured has any premises liability, any hangers keeper liability, or any products liability, that would be factored into the liability premium. It's worth noting that in terms of the whole premium, that's generally charged as a percentage of the aircraft value, whereas the liability premium is simply charged as a currency amount against that particular limit or against that particular aircraft. So with that said, I'm now going to hand over to Matt, who's going to speak about the aviation deductible element of coverage.
Thanks, Jimmy. So as Jimmy mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about one of the ancillary coverages, which falls underneath the whole policy on the all risk placement, known as whole deductible or whole deductible buy down. This covers first party physical damage. So the layer of whole cover that Jimmy was presenting is ultimately the main layer, as this has upper limits of the aircraft's top value. This layer or policy has a deductible of, say, $1 million. So any loss underneath this layer will be covered by the airline. So the question that airlines have to ask themselves is whether or not they want to self-insure all whole claims from zero to their excess. And an example I've used, up to 1 million. There's obviously a high level of risk with that layer, and airlines would often want to offset that risk. And that's where whole deductible buy down comes in. So ultimately, whole deductible is a policy that covers the layer underneath the main whole all risks policy, which means that the insured has the opportunity to buy down that deductible with a much smaller excess to that of their whole all risk policy. So it is important to notice that there is still an excess point, and which at what level is often down to the insured themselves. Typical whole deductible excess points would be 250,000, 100,000, or even as low as 50,000. The level of excess on the whole deductible policy can be dictated by their premium budget or expenditure. For instance, the higher the excess, there's less exposure for underwriters, but cheaper premium. The lower the excess, the more cover the insured has, but at a higher premium. A reason why deductible is important on any policy, whether that's the main whole layer or the whole deductible buy down, is because underwriters would like to encourage the insured to share some of the claim, albeit it's generally a small percentage. And the reason why that is important is because the handling of claims can quickly become expensive to handle and disproportionate from the claim itself. And generally, it could discourage any form of negligence. Another purpose of deductibles on the whole risk policy is to take away some of the smaller claims. And by taking away some of the smaller claims, it ideally means that the insured's main whole and liability policy remains clean or has nil losses, which in turn makes their business more attractive to quoting underwriters. But it also emphasises the importance of buying whole deductible cover, as these smaller attritional losses can quickly erode any premium. So I'm just going to run through some of the key elements of whole deductible, starting with the first party physical damage. So think of this as a policy that responds to each and every whole claim. So these claims can very quickly add up. Underwriters would traditionally protect themselves by adding in what is known as an annual policy aggregate. So if a policy has accumulated a whole bunch of claims, or they hit or exceed the annual policy aggregate, that policy is effectively over and insured will require a new policy. It's a separate class due to new levels and greater demand for cover. So aircraft values have gone up. As Jimmy's mentioned, it's a very expensive asset and airlines want to protect their main balance sheet. The standard whole all risk policy excess were created in the 80s. The traditional policy excess amounts are 1,750,000, 500,000 and 100,000, which is usually dictated by the aircraft type. The whole deductible is the policy layer that's underneath those amounts. It isn't compulsory to buy whole deductible cover. It is expected that the airlines are the ones who decide whether they purchase the cover. However, it is estimated that half of commercial aircraft are leased, and it's often the lessor will want to protect their asset and will insist on airlines purchasing a whole deductible policy. Some general exclusions are a total loss. So a whole deductible policy will only react to a partial loss. A total loss is when an aircraft is completely beyond repair, or a controlled total loss is when all parties in the event of an incident are in agreement that the aircraft is damaged beyond repair. So all forms of total loss are excluded from a whole deductible policy, as major losses were not the reason why whole deductible policies exist today. They're in demand purely to take away attritional losses or small claims from the whole all risk policy. Another exclusion would be mechanical breakdown, wear and tear. Rating factors, aircraft type, engine variant, area of operation, very similar to what Jimmy discussed on his rating. So it's very similar. We look at the loss history, of course. And the market capacity, unlike a lot of Lloyd's products, including the whole risk placement, which is, as Jimmy mentioned, on a subscription basis, where insurers write a percentage line, whole deductible is traditionally written on a 100% basis as the limits are considered low. So before I give some examples, show you the importance of the products and how it works in the market, it's important for you to understand a bit more about the four main categories of aircraft that we use to help us quote the business. The first aircraft type is known as a wide-bodied aircraft, which is due to the size of the aircraft. You'll see from the images they have 10 seats across, which is predominantly the largest width of a passenger aircraft. I'm showing the main two manufacturers in the pictures, Airbus and Boeing, who of course dominate the market, but we of course insure other manufacturers such as the Embraer from Brazil, Sukhoi Superjet from Russia, and there are many more. The whole or risk deductible for a wide body is 1 million, which again means that the upper limit is the total aircraft value, and it's brought down to 1 million. And therefore the layer that I'm discussing is the layer underneath, shown in the graphic in orange. So any whole loss will first hit the green layer, which isn't covered by insurers. That would be insured by the airline themselves. And then anything above that 100,000 would be covered in the whole deductible policy. So losses can very, very quickly add up. And occasionally, or quite a lot of the time, they don't go into the blue layer, which is the whole risk layer. And the whole point of the deductible orange layer is to take away losses from that blue layer to keep policies clean. So the second, third and fourth aircraft types are the hybrid aircraft, which is something in between the one next to it, the narrow body. So the hybrid has an all-risk deductible of 750,000, and some examples of the aircraft type are the very common B737 and A320. And just an example of a whole deductible limit is 650,000 excess of 100, and that's just 750. The excess could be 50,000 or 250,000. The narrow body, very similar, but slightly lower whole risk deductible of 500,000. And then lastly, a turboprop sort of aircraft like an ATR shown in the picture would have a whole risk deductible of 100,000. This would fall into the general aviation market. An example of a whole deductible limit might just be a smaller 50,000 excess of 50,000. So I'm just going to show you some of the claims that we see. We have FODs, or foreign object debris. FOD is basically anything that does not belong to the runway and becomes ingested in the engine, which can ultimately cause some serious damage. Boeing believe that FOD losses can cause an estimated 4 billion every year, which is accumulated from both the physical hull aspect, what we would cover as insurers, and then the aftermath, delays, aircraft returning to service, etc., which we wouldn't cover. Some typical examples of an FOD would be aircraft parts, tyre fragments, mechanics tools, or even parts that mechanics have left behind that haven't been cleared away, nuts, bolts, or even stones. Could even be passenger luggage that get ingested into an engine. Airports do work incredibly closely with airlines to prevent this type of loss, and will always use various systems and software to do so. And then we unfortunately do have bird strikes. It is quite a common claim, unfortunately. It's exactly as it sounds when birds or other wildlife strike the aircraft. Unfortunately, from a wildlife perspective, birds do become ingested in an engine, which is more common on takeoff or landing. It can be an incredibly expensive loss for deductible underwriters. In the two pictures at the bottom, you can see a close-up of an aircraft engine. The metal parts are fan blades, and typical cost of a single fan blade could be anything from $60,000 to $120,000. So something going through the engine that hits multiple fan blades soon becomes very, very expensive for underwriters. We do work alongside specialist companies whose number one goal is to protect wildlife. It isn't in anybody's interest for wildlife to be damaging aircraft or aircraft to be damaging wildlife. So we do everything that we can to prevent this type of loss. And then lastly, just some other types of losses that we see. We have ground handling incidents, which can be a number of things. In the picture, you can see a passenger stairwell that's accidentally collided with an aircraft. This would cause significant damage. It would certainly hit the whole deductible layer, potentially beyond. Some other types of ground handling incidents might involve airside vehicles, catering vehicles, cleaners, and refuelers. The next picture along is a hard landing. The landing gear collapsed. The pilots were aware of the issue and had to make an emergency landing. All the passengers were safely evacuated, but as you can see, there will be significant hull damage to the frame of the aircraft. Lightning strike, it rarely causes significant damage in terms of a severe incident, and they would often on landing do an inspection of the aircraft to see the resulting damage. Aircraft are designed to conduct electricity, so it should pass straight through without any major damage to the actual flight itself. And then lastly, severe weather. It's pretty self-explanatory. It can cause significant damage to aircraft. In that picture, it's been damaged from hailstones, but we do have other factors. The lighter aircraft, like I showed you, the ATR, they are prone to strong winds and tornadoes and can be simply blown slightly over and can cause some significant damage. So I just wanted to run through some type of common claims that we see in the deductible market before passing you over to Michael, who is going to discuss the whole war.
Thanks, Matt. Over the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about whole war insurance, what's covered, how we view risk, look at some past events and look at some current conflicts. Whole war insurance is an ancillary coverage to all risk policy. As Jimmy mentioned earlier, there's an exclusion clause called Aviation 48B, which excludes claims for, or excludes cover for claims as a result of war and allied perils. This could be anything from malicious damage to hijacking or war events, which you'll see on the next slide. This exclusion leaves quite a large gap in cover for the insured. And as we've seen, aircraft do range in value up to hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's not only in the insured's interest to close this gap, but lessors do often require full coverage. There are two ways in which they can do this. They can firstly look to have some of those perils written back within the all risk policy through a clause called Aviation 51. This is, however, a limited right back and wouldn't satisfy most contractual requirements from the lessor. They would therefore look to buy a standalone whole war policy, which is where we come in. This provides a seamless back-to-back cover for the hull of the aircraft alongside the all risk policy. Standalone whole war policies are typically written for a standard wording called LSW 555D. The main premise of this is to write back those excluded perils. You can see the list of perils on the left-hand side of the screen, ranging from war, strikes, malicious damage, so vandalism, confiscation, and hijacking. Like all insurance policies, there are exclusions, some of which do cross over with the all risk policy. So losses outside of specified geographical limits. You may have an aircraft that's only allowed to operate within mainland Europe, but has an incident in Africa. The underwriter will be able to deny the claim. Likewise with the uses, these are preset within the policy. So if the insured was found to be using the aircraft for something that they wasn't permitted to, or whether it's a legal use, there will be grounds to deny a claim. Losses or damage directly or indirectly arising out of the detonation of a weapon of war employing a nuclear or atomic fission is a peril that's excluded from whole war policies, but it's also excluded from all insurance policies. And confiscation is unusual because it is an exclusion within the whole war policy. However, it is typically written back in most whole war policies. You'll see that the last point is separated from the exclusions. This is because it's not technically an exclusion. However, if there were a major war to break out between the 5 major powers, being the UK, the US, China, Russia, or France, whole war policies would be automatically cancelled. Whole war insurance is charged on a very similar basis to the hull all risks. The rate is, we would use these rating considerations to create a percentage rate, which will be charged against the value of the aircraft. I'm just going to run through the main considerations that we'll take into account. The first factor will be the type and the value of the aircraft. Whole war insurance is very much a low frequency but high severity class of business. That said, the frequency of whole war claims has been increasing throughout the years. So because of the high severity element of it, with aircraft ranging from hundreds of thousands to hundreds of millions of dollars, you wouldn't want to leave yourself too exposed on the top end of that. Likewise, with multiple aircraft events, if you have a policy with a large fleet value, Aircraft would park next to each other, create a higher risk of multiple aircraft ground attacks. So here we would look to implement a policy aggregate limit to reduce this exposure. Like, we would also look at the type of aircraft, paying close attention to whether it's a rotor wing aircraft or fixed wing airline equipment. Helicopters tend to fly at a lower altitude, so depending on the area of the world, it poses a higher risk for ground-to-air attack. Airline equipment, on the other hand, flies at a much higher altitude, so this risk is reduced. The area of operation is obviously very important. Here we would be looking at the political stability of the country or the terror threat posed in that country. So if you were looking at insuring a helicopter in France, it would obviously pose a very different risk score to that of a helicopter flying in Libya. The way in which we assess risk here would be through intelligence service providers. These providers will have specialists worldwide who can give us up-to-date information on risk scores or risks in regions of countries and forecast future events. When looking at an aviation policy, we can limit our exposure here through the implementation of geographical limit clauses. The clause on the left is LSW 617H, which is a very common clause in the aviation market. This allows an aircraft to fly on a worldwide basis, excluding a number of countries. These countries, I'd like to add, here is a very standard clause. And the reason that the countries are on there is because of previous events. If we were, however, looking to ensure an operation here, we do have the ability to write back those countries. Lastly, it's worth noting that political situations can change very quickly. So whole war policies have a clause built in with them, which allows a 7-day notice to review. So here, we could issue a 7-day notice informally the policy holder that we would like to change the conditions of the policy or the terms due to a material change in the risk score of the region or the operation. And at the end of that 7 days, the insured would have to either accept those changes or cancel the policy. The type of operations are very important here, looking at standard uses such as industrial aid uses or commercial passenger carriage, or whether they're carrying out higher risk activities such as police work, anti-narcotic operations, as well as the others that you can see on the screen. And lastly, we would look at the loss history, not only looking at the insured, but looking at whether there have been recurring whole war losses in the region that they're operating. The quality of the operators are very important, looking closely at the risk assessments that they carry out on those areas that they operate in, how in depth the security team look at certain perils. And lastly, those perils covered, there are additional coverages available within the policy. So we would factor this in, whether it's work expenses, loss of use, or whether we include or exclude government of registration. Looking at past events, 9/11 is one of, or if not the most significant whole war or aviation event that the world has ever seen. We've seen a number of hijackings throughout the years. However, we haven't seen any other simultaneous hijackings where the aircraft were used as a weapon itself. In 2014, during the second Libyan civil war, we saw the Battle of Tripoli. This battle was when Zintan militia were attempting to take control of the airport following the fall of Gaddafi. You can see on the screen that there was a large scale damage. This ranged from commercial operators to commercial passenger operators down to general aviation operators. The battle lasted for a number of days and involved heavy artillery and missile damage. It caused hundreds of millions of dollars of damage, and this remains one of the largest events that we've seen as an insurance market. Similarly, in 2014, there were 2 market events involving Malaysian Airlines aircraft. You would have seen on the news, the first one was MH370. This was a flight that This is an aircraft that was lost between Beijing and Kuala Lumpur. The whereabouts of the aircraft are still unknown. So how does any insurance policy react when there's no one knows what happened, or no one knows approximate cause? So within all risk policies and the whole war policies, there's a clause called AVS 103. This is a claim settlement clause that essentially allows the all risks underwriter and the whole war underwriter to each pay 50% of the whole damage or the whole value to the insured in order for them to be reimbursed or re-indemnified as soon as possible. It is then the responsibility of the all risks underwriter to prove that this loss was as a result of an excluded peril within their policy. This typically falls into arbitration. This happened with MH370, where it stayed in arbitration for a number of years until 2019, when a judge deemed that the probable cause of the loss fell within the whole war policy. The whole war insurer would then indemnify the all risks underwriter for their 50% share of the hull of that aircraft. The next incident for Malaysian Airlines happened in July 2014, when an MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine. Due to the nature of this event, it clearly fell within the whole war policy. We will lastly look at current conflicts that we're seeing. The image on the screen on the left, you can see is an image of a drone. This drone would have been used to carry an explosive into Saudi Arabia. For a number of years now, there's been fighting within Yemen, and Yemeni Houthi rebels have been targeting Saudi Arabian assets. Saudi Arabia do have very sophisticated missile defense systems. However, they've had to develop these throughout the last few years to take into account the lower flying and slower flying drones. These drones have become more sophisticated, they've become larger, and they can carry much bigger payloads. The top right image is a Saudi Arabian oil facility. This came under attack from not only missiles, but drones. And the bottom right-hand image is damage to an aircraft in Saudi Arabia, which was as a result of an explosive being carried by a drone. So that leads us on to COVID-19, the current pandemic that Jimmy will be talking about.
Thanks very much, Michael. So as is the case, it seems that no general discussion or presentation is complete without discussing COVID, and our aviation insurance presentation is not exempt from that. So over the course of the next few slides, I'm going to discuss the effect of the pandemic upon the airline industry. So the purpose of the first slide is to demonstrate the effect of the pandemic upon the airline industry's profitability. According to IATA, between 2010 and 2019, the airline industry accumulated $220 billion worth of profits. Between 2020 and Q2 2021, the airline industry was estimated to have lost $175 billion. Just to put those sums into context, within 18 months of the pandemic, we effectively managed to, not we, but the airline industry effectively managed to wipe out 80% of that 10-year profit pot. Looking at the next slide, this demonstrates the effect of the pandemic upon global passenger numbers, airline passenger numbers, again, according to IATA data. If we look at 2019, it was estimated that there were 4.8 billion passengers traveling worldwide on airline. If you then compare that to 2020, which saw the height of the pandemic, that number fell to 1.7 billion. That's a reduction of 65%. Looking at 2021, when these numbers were forecasted, the total for 2021 is said to be 2.4 billion, which is an increase of 43% on 2020 numbers. Looking ahead into 2022, there are signs of optimism, with numbers reaching 4 billion. It should be noted that this is an increase of 66%, albeit numbers remaining 18% below pre-COVID numbers. So with a reduction in the number of passengers traveling around the world, and then the reduction in aircraft departures, we've seen an increase in the number of aircraft grounded. The image on the screen presents the 10 busiest airports across the world and demonstrates the number of aircraft that are grounded and their total market value as of June 2020. So if we were to take Singapore Airport, for example, at the top of that list, you've got 228 airplanes that were grounded with a market value of just under 19 billion. Again, just to put these large sums into context, the numbers on the right-hand side. So as of June 2020, the total market value of those grounded aircraft at those 10 busiest airports was 136 billion, in comparison with 81 billion, which was pre-COVID. So it's probably best to wrap the presentation up by discussing what COVID has meant for insurance underwriters and aviation insurance underwriters more specifically, and connecting that to the three coverages that we've discussed within the presentation. So from an all risk perspective, as I've just mentioned there, you've seen an increase in the ground exposures, which gives a potential increase in the likelihood of a large scale claim from natural perils such as large weather events, hailstorm damage, tornadoes or hurricanes. From an operational standpoint, insurers have had a keen interest in how airlines have ensured that their pilots have remained current on the aircraft that they're operating, what training procedures they've had in place in line with the pandemic guidelines. Equally, insurers have had a keen interest in how airlines have maintained their aircraft, ensuring that they've remained airworthy at all times and looking to minimise any potential accidents. From a deductible perspective, again, it comes back to that increase of ground accumulation of aircraft. It increases that likelihood of ground incidents with all aircraft in a very small space in large exposures. From an operational standpoint, deductible insurers have got a keen interest in how airports and airfields have ensured that they've undertaken necessary actions to ensure that it's safe airside for aircraft to take off from the runways and to land. And from a whole war perspective, as Michael touched upon, the increase in ground exposures has been both an interest and a concern to whole war insurers. It's a concerning number of aggregated aircraft all in a close proximity, and in the event of any escalating conflict around that airport perimeter, it could result in a large loss if there was damage sustained to any aircraft that may be airside. So with that said, that brings us to the end of the presentation. We'd like to thank you all for your time. Hopefully you found it informative and relatively interesting. And with that said, we'd like to open the forum to any questions that you may have.
Many thanks, Jimmy, Michael, and Matt. Such a great presentation. I'm so glad to hear everything you've just said, and I just want to remind our guest attendees here that please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box, and I will transmit them over to our speakers. And but perhaps I just want to make a quick comment and share with you an experience I have lived myself in my past life when I was working as a risk manager for an airline. Just to give you an example of how important not only the aviation industry is for the world, but also the insurance for the aviation industry is for the world. You know, as you can see from my gray hair, you know, I go back long ago, and I lived myself the 9/11 events as a risk manager of a very large airline, a flag carrier of Brazil at the time. And you've touched on that when you were presenting the war risks coverage, saying that you know, one of the features of the war risk coverage is the 7 days notice of cancellation, if that is needed, right? So 9/11 was a moment where that notice of cancellation was issued. And from one day to another, on 9/11, the entire world fleet of aircraft, all of the airlines around the world were under notice of cancellation, which meant at the time that they wouldn't be covered for all of their fleet if they couldn't find a replacement for the coverage, right? And most of as we all know, most of the aircraft are financed or leased. And the owners of the aircraft, the financiers and the lessors, they all said, and that's part of the contracts, they all say, you know, if you don't have insurance coverage in place, you have to ground the aircraft. So in that moment, the entire world was in a situation whereby airlines were about to have to ground the aircraft fleet. And there wouldn't be any air transportation because of that, because the airlines could not themselves bear the risk of flying an aircraft without having the proper insurance coverage. So there was a huge effort from everyone around the world. I remember attending meetings on the ICAO in Montreal with government authorities and all of the airlines, and all discussing how to deal with it. To a certain point, the governments had to step up and provide the coverage because coverage was not available. The market came back later on and managed to get the offer of coverage for the airlines. So that was solved. But that shows how important it is to have the insurance market there available to protect the airlines, to protect the financiers, to protect the economy, because can you imagine an essential service such as the air transportation not being available to the world? That's something that we have never experienced, and I hope we will never experience something like that. Yeah, you want to make a comment there?
No, please.
So thank you for that. So sorry, after sharing that experience, I just want to take the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions here. So you mentioned that the whole deductibles were set in the 1980s, and what limitations does this impose in today's market?
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the question. So yeah, they were set in the 80s, about 35 years ago. Aircraft values were they were a lot lower back then, and deductibles have stayed exactly where they are. So that doesn't quite align with where aircraft values are today. So one question that we're asking ourselves as a market is, should the deductibles be increased as the level of aircraft has increased as well? And another question we've asked is it costing the same amount to repair aircraft today as it was back then? So using the hull as an example, we used to aircraft were obviously traditionally made of heavier metals. They were robust, they were strong, and they could handle like a slight knock into each other. And they weren't as fuel efficient purely down to the weight. But today aircraft are built with composite materials which are lighter. They're more fuel efficient. There's a big pressure on airlines to be greener, to be more environmentally friendly. But it does have its limitations to us as underwriters, because the composite materials are lighter, but they're also softer. So any bump or scrape will be much more significant to what they would have been back then, and they become much more expensive. The older aircraft, you could do patchwork on them, believe it or not, and you could patch a small area and it'd be good enough to take off again. But you couldn't do that with a composite material. You have to replace the whole panel, and it becomes much more expensive. So your simple bumps and scrapes around an airport, they might have been a couple of $100,000, whereas now they're going straight through the deductible. So it is something that is being discussed in the market, and there is potentially going to be some sort of increase in deductibles, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, thanks for that. I remember my times, a wide-body aircraft such as the 747, 777, they all had $1 million deductible for damage. And I remember at that time, 777 would cost about 120 million, more or less. How much does it cost today? Close to 200 million, maybe?
Yeah, they could exceed $200 million if you're looking at an A380, for example, and they still carry the same whole deductible.
Yeah.
So there you go. I mean, the deductible is still the same. The value of the aircraft is much higher. So, but let me ask you a question about that. I remember that big airlines in my times, they were very reluctant to buy deductible insurance. They were much more into the taking the risk of the deductible. So is that something that has changed over time? Are they now considering buying deductible insurance? Maybe because the cost is more attractive today. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, some of the smaller airlines with a smaller fleet tend to buy. It protects their balance sheet. If you have a policy limit claim that goes straight through, it could be really detrimental to the future of that airline. Some of the bigger airlines wouldn't buy. They're big enough to cover the losses themselves. But a lot of smaller airlines would definitely still look to buy just to protect their balance sheet and to make sure they're okay going forward. But yeah, I mean, a lot of airlines are still buying it. We are seeing losses go straight through, right the way through. So yeah, they do buy it. We've been doing it I've been writing deductible for probably 14 years now. So yeah, it's still reasonably strong, and there are airlines still buying it.
Yeah, that is something that you know, I think everyone should really look into because it's a very interesting coverage available in the market.
Absolutely.
Another question here. You spoke about Yemen as a current conflict in the whole war market. What other current conflicts are you seeing around the world that you could share with us here?
Afghanistan is very much a current conflict that we're seeing. You'll probably all know that last year, President Biden announced the withdrawal of the US military following 2 decades of presence. Now, following this announcement, there has been increased presence of the Taliban as they attempt to regain control of the country. This presence really has increased throughout the last year, and coming into sort of July, August, the conflicts really erupted, and towards the middle of August, they gained control of the majority of the country and finally took control of the capital, Kabul. As insurers, it caused obviously issues for us securing the airport. It came under military, it was under military control. There were reports of damaged assets, but these could not be confirmed because of restrictions. And with the hundreds of thousands of people being evacuated, we were then faced with questions with regards to, or decisions to be made with regards to the insurance coverage of humanitarian flights, which, as you pointed out, it's incredibly important to get that insurance coverage. And it's difficult when there's a lack of infrastructure and there's a lack of air traffic control because they've been deserted, and the overall control of that airport being under the US military. The US military then withdrew at the end of August, leaving really the country in control of the Taliban. So that air traffic control is still not being manned. There's a NOTAM flyer, a NOTAM notice on the sort of for that airspace. It's really a no-fly zone other than a small area sort of in the northwest of the country. So yeah, it was quite a difficult period, and it really escalated very quickly.
I think, yeah, just touching on what Michael said there, it was the speed of the escalation that really caught us by surprise. It went against all the forecasts that we had. Michael touched upon the intelligence providers, and we was well, you know, the insurance market, the general public were well aware that the US were going to withdraw over the course of the next 12 months. But it was actually the speed of the Taliban in terms of how they took Kandahar with such ease, and then they actually took Kabul and the airport, which become, you know, the center point for where the Afghan people were trying to flee the country. And yeah, as Michael said, it was a concerning period for insurers because he was aware of assets on the ground, and yeah, it was just the lack of information that you could get out of that area, and it resulted in some long weeks and some long weekends of working. But it seems to have calmed down somewhat. But that was the most current conflict that we should probably of note more to say.
Can imagine. Listen, Jimmy, Michael, and Matt, thank you very, very much indeed for your presentation today. I'm sure our attendees here have loved it, and I want to thank the Lancashire Syndicate for taking the time. I know it's quite late in London now. I can see, you know, how dark it is.
Yeah, actually just turned out the lights, by the way, so I think that's
I'm sure you are the last one in the office, so it's time to go home. I'm sure it's time to go home. So thank you very much for that. I just want to take the opportunity. This is the last session of the Lloyd's Latin America and the Caribbean Academy. I'm joined today by Daniel Revere, the head of the region here, and Yelvis Hernandez. I just want to let them say a few words to our attendees about our program and say farewell and see you next year, right? So thank you very much. I'll pass over to Yelvis, please. Yelvis, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Marco. And thank you very much to the Lancashire team. Really, really good presentation, very insightful. And also I wanted to say thank you to all of the participants across the regions for their commitment with the Academy, especially for those who will obtain the diploma and for those who will obtain the certificate. We are very, very pleased to see many of you achieving this goal alongside with us. I look forward for the second cohort in 2022, and your feedback on how we can improve the Academy next year will be very, very welcome. Thank you again. Daniel?
Thank you, Yelvis. And just to say thanks to everyone, but especially to those who have been behind putting all of this together. To Diana, to Valdir, to Sebastián, to Yelgis, and to Marco as well for putting all the work to coordinate the academy. I think it has been a fantastic effort, very successful. I'm very grateful for all of the knowledge that has been shared. Thank you guys and have a good one. See you soon.